And then moving back to the wheel well area, the rear wheel wells, you can see, I wanted to show what that looked like with the wheels off. So with the wheels off, you can see that there's body color overspray. You can also see what the original texturing and the patterns look like. The wheel well areas themselves look phenomenal. I mean, not just the back, but the front, all four of them, they look like they're brand new. Wouldn't expect that, but that held up really, really nicely. And then I did take one of the drums off because I did want to document what the color of the springs were and what that looked like. It still had the original retainers on the drums, so in my opinion, it was never off of the car. The fuel tank, you have a drain plug, which is expected in 68. Original sender, C8 sender. The original clamps on here, the knuckle buster clamps with the square edges on there. The leaf springs, so we have original dated leaf springs. These are May 8th. And leaf springs typically have a spray or a dab of paint. It's usually back here. On this one, it's a bit of an anomaly. They're actually in the front here. So it's a silver color. Silver color is what you would expect on here. You just don't expect it to be on the front of the leaf spring. And let me get a light on that. You can see that better. You can see that one. You can see a little bit of drip right there of the paint. You could also see some of the seam sealer in the back here and through here, the way that looks. These are galvanized. The floor drain plugs. Well, maybe we see this one bad. This one looks better. You can see the galvanized finish on there, and the strip caulk that goes around there. It's the way we expect it to be. Then moving on to the transmission. A transmission, I was able to get a mechanic scope up there and verify that the VIN number is on top of the transmission. If you know where to look, you have to have a scope to get it, but it's not that difficult if you do. There's the tag. The tag shows us April 15th, D15th is the date on there. The transmission mount. It's interesting. We got a blue color on there. There's the original output seal. That has a Fomoco on it as well, so that's never been changed. C8ZA numbers on the mount. These cables also the emergency brake cables. You can see a little bit of yellow on there on both sides. I see the Fomoco on this one. A little bit of yellow paint. So moving on to the front of the car, I'll go over some different details on here as well. So I did take the wheels off. I wanted to show what the fender wells looked like with the wheels off. You can see a lot of the different finishes that are on there, sealers, the textures, and it looks really, really good. When we're doing a restoration, this would be ideally what we want to see. And both sides, so on all of the wheel wells, front and back, we see the same thing. The car never did have a front end alignment, so take the light here. How do we know that? There's no marks on the tie rod adjusting sleeve. So you see that there, see the tie rod adjusting sleeve here. And I'll point out a couple things. The first thing is, you see the orientation of the sleeves, the way they point down. There was actually a Ford technical service bulletin that was for the technicians. If I remember correctly, 65, 66 model years. If these are pointed forward, they could actually cause, interestingly enough, like a whistling noise because of the way the slot and the air would pass through there. So Ford came up with a spec to turn these, and there's some variation to it, but straight down would be fine to see that and would not cause an issue. You have two different vendors on here, and the hardware for the adjusters, they're fine thread, which is also expected in 68. One of them is marked with an A. That would be for Ajax Bolt Corporation. and the other one is marked with a RSC, which is Republic Steel Corporation. So interesting little detail. The tie rods, the original tie rods, all have a little B stamp on there. Maybe see this one better. There we go. That's typical. And sometimes, like that one, there is none. So it's the same tie rod. Not really sure what that B stamp is, but that's what we look for. I mean, that would be, if I wanted to get one, would be ideal. But same car here, you have this one without a B, and then this one with a B. Here you can see the cotter pins, typically the way they were folded over like that. You can see that pretty good there. Maybe another one over here. The lower control arms there, just the way we see originals, right? They're dipped in paint. So about 2/3 of it's dipped in paint. It didn't make sense to have paint on the end of it there where the ball joint assembly was and the boot and so on. Earlier years, 65 and 66, they did it on the upper control arms as well, but 67 and on, they only did it, the paint on the lower control arms. The camber bolt, you can see that there. I'm going to say typically these were installed from the other direction, from the front of the car, but it's not unusual. There is plenty of cars that have been documented where it's installed this way. Ford had assembly line drawings. Were those always followed? No, not necessarily, but I do think what's a little unusual here is you see the red coloring on them. You can see the red coloring on both the front and coming through there. That whole thing was red. And that I don't find typically. Lower cross member for the engine. You can see the Fomoco that's stamped there in the middle. And these are pretty glossy usually. Glossier than most of the black under here. And then there's a flat spot. You can see that flat spot right there. And that's always oriented over here by the power steering control valve. For the upper control arms are a cutback style. The cutback style was used or started to be used around April of 1968 with the introduction of the Cobra Jet Mustangs. Larger wheel sizes, Ford felt that they had to cut those edges off for clearance. It did cause problems. They did go back to the previous version then in 69. But you can see that that was being used here consistent with what a June 68 car would be. Also the coil springs, you can see the colors on there for the coil springs. You have a violet and an orange, yellow on the control arm shaft, paint dab on there. And then coming back here to the actual control valve. Control valve is dated on the end on the cap, 8A27, which is January 27th, 1968. The hoses, you can see there, the original hoses. General belief is that these were silver on the ends, 67, 68, and then zinc dichromate, 69 and 70. It's hard to tell. I kind of think that these were a zinc dichromate. After all these years, it's hard to make that out, and the gold does fade over time. But the hoses are dated 1378, which is May 16th, 1968. The worm clamp is unique. This is the only place you'll see a worm clamp used on an early first generation Mustang. This was from the manufacturer, from Bendix. They put this all together and held that in place. And then this was just installed on the car this way. That clamp has a Trident Burlington, Canada logo on it. So that was the manufacturer of the worm clamp. The power steering ram is dated, it's actually dated May 68. That's a Bendix unit. The date is on the top. You could see the clamp for the boot. There's a little bit of white paint on it, which we see on originals. The idler arm, yellow paint dab, which is typical for power steering. Pink would be for manual steering. Yellow on the center link. So the center link also has some green paint dab there, not typical, I would say an anomaly. I don't think that they would be identified that way normally. The backs of the wheels, you can see the white paint dabs that identified these steel wheels on both of them. And then the shocks on the front are dated May 1968. If I remember correctly, the 4th week of May 68, so very close to what we have on the rear shocks. They're basically built the same time. The front strut rod is a bare finish, and then you can see the washers, the type of washers, and the hardware on the front. The strut rod bushings themselves, the front is a C8OA 3A140-A is the engineering number that's in the rubber, and then the rear one would be a C8OA 3A225-A. And point two other things out as far as paint. You can see the runs in the paint and the engine. That's, you know, typical. The engine wasn't done perfectly. There's bare spots on the engine if you get up all around and look at it. And then the front of the car, if we look at the front of the car, it's actually a red oxide. So red oxide is used here where you have more of the salmon color here. You don't notice it unless you look really closely. And if I show you the transition, that's where you can see it a little bit better. So you have salmon color here. This is the automated process coming down the assembly line. So all of this is being sprayed with all the runs and all the drips that you see. It stops, and then here, what was being done by hand, like I mentioned earlier, you have more of this red oxide color, and you see the two of them side by side. It's subtle, but once you see it and you look for it, you can see that. And that's consistent with all three assembly lines, that you're going to have a slightly different coloring in the front in this area here. So yeah, that concludes the undercarriage. I wanted to really highlight this car and save it for future restorations and reference, so we have this. You don't find very many like that with this level of detail. Hopefully we find that useful. They're only original once, a good friend of mine told me, and this certainly shows all of that. 1968, 12,000 mile unrestored car.